comes, please. Please, let's clap for him till he gets down here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the president of Pengassan Worldwide and the members of the Central Working Committee, the planners of this summit, for having me here. As part of the summit theme, which talks about deregulation and then gas utilization, both of which are actually both sides of the same coin, because once we deregulate, we have a higher price of energy, and then we need alternative sources. The question is, how do we enhance domestic gas utilization? And that is exactly what my job is today. To set the tone for my presentation, I'd like to say that fossil fuels provide 80% of the world energy, and is undoubtedly the energy foundation upon which global societies function. As such, a sudden shift in the composition of that foundation can potentially destabilize the global economy and key elements of modern society. Energy transformation is shaped by a much broader and fundamental shift in terms of prosperity, progress, and politics and environment. And one of the cornerstones of this huge transition is the concept of decarbonization. Next slide, please. Okay, leave it there. The ongoing transformation does not concern and apply to the energy sector, nor does it talk about a switch from one fuel type to another, or merely a technological leap. It is much broader and reflects a transformation in terms of the values and the way we understand the world around us today. The great transition features a gradual breakaway from the older core values of security, reliability, and sustainability and robustness, which the current energy systems are built on, to new values of sustainability, flexibility, affordability, enabled by a completely new way of producing, delivering, and consuming energy. Next slide. Next one. All right. This doesn't really mean that the older frame values, core values, will become obsolete. What it means is that the center's weight is certainly being rebalanced. With more than 200 TCF of proven gas reserve, quoted at about 208 by the NUPRC, which is the highest in Africa, Nigeria is naturally endowed with the key imperative required to rebalance its energy mix in a way that engenders domestic industrial development whilst optimizing energy availability, affordability, accessibility, and acceptability. Next slide, please. It is important for us to understand the emerging trends that typify the energy industry or the oil and gas industry in particular today. We have divestments, the drive to optimize capital efficiency. We also have energy transition, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, and deregulation of the Nigerian downstream sector. Next slide. The slide here shows us the entire Nigerian gas value chain. And what we can see is predominantly that the value chain was optimized through its legacy design for export. And the reason is this: much of our initial concept was around getting economic rents from oil. And so the gas development was actually an afterthought, which again, we can see that we're not utilizing as much in the domestic concept. But we have made certain progress. Despite this progress for gas utilization, we still have to flare, actually, because technically that's something that we do as part of our operations. And the reason is because, one, lack of the infrastructure to harness some of this gas from the fields. Even when we want to inject, we still have limitations in the reservoirs that can take some of this gas. And then the cost of expanding our gas pipeline network and the difficult terrain of the Niger Delta in linking some of these gas resources. Next slide. So when we look at flaring statistics, we need to superimpose the fact that although we have made efforts, there's still a lot of flare, which I will talk about what the government has thought about doing later. But we need to understand the opportunity cost of gas flaring in totality. And we look at this and we find out that there is a lot that we could have done with the money. I mean, there are a lot of statistics out there, but it definitely tells us that there is a lot of money that we've lost from actually flaring for a number of years. Before we dig deeper, next slide. Before we dig deeper, let us look at the most basic, consumption of gas. What is the level that we have of consumption of gas that we have at the moment? And let's look at it from a domestic standpoint from our homes. You find out that Nigeria has one of the lowest, actually, in among developing countries, with about 3 kg per person. My next slide is going to tell us exactly why. Next slide. If you review the LPG supply, you would find out that we are actually still importing, as of today, a substantial amount of LPG into Nigeria. With the fact that we have forex issues, of course, that again drives that high price, which is what exactly informs the low consumption of LPG in different households. Next slide. So when we look at things holistically, the question is, what exactly have the government been doing? Again, I started by saying the legacy design for the industry was actually looking at economic rents for oil, because again, it was very profitable. But over time, we realized that there was a potential in gas. And it's interesting and important to note that until you begin to consume energy, then you cannot industrialize using energy. And gas is one of those choices of fuel that we can use to industrialize. So we've come a long way from a regulatory standpoint, coming from where we made laws to make sure that we utilize this gas as much as possible by either consuming it on site or re-injecting it into the reservoirs, to where we do an environmental impact assessment to make sure that if we're flaring, we understand and characterize the damage to the environment, and then we can mitigate where possible. And then we came on to the national gas policy, which is the framework within which Nigeria intends to develop its gas resources. And then, of course, the flare regulations, which again permits the government to go take gas at flare sites and monetize, which is the bedrock of the Nigerian gas flare commercialization program. And of course, the Nigerian Gas Transportation Network Code, which intends to set entry requirements for the midstream, which was non-existent before now, and the Petroleum Industry Act. Building on these regulatory provisions have been several initiatives. The Decade of Gas Initiative, which again brings about the Nigerian Gas Expansion Program and the Nigerian Gas Commercialization Program. The Nigerian Gas Commercialization Program, just in a nutshell, was looking at getting flare gas from the sites and giving it to competent people, third-party people. But unfortunately, I have to say it's taking too long to actualize, and that's not a good signal to the international community. When we look at gas monetization, next slide, we need to understand that there are several options, and I put this slide here because there might be people in the room who might be considering getting to the gas, the gas business. We need to understand that there's a range of possibilities, and there are what we call in engineering boundary conditions that will govern and determine whether these possibilities apply to you or not. Again, the size and quality of the gas resource, the location of the resource relative to the market that you're targeting, local and export market, the competitiveness of the end products that you're targeting, the manpower and skills availability, requirement for strategic partners, again, maybe financiers or foreign governments, the environmental approval requirements, technology availability and reliability, and the logistics for project construction. Next slide. The next slide really focuses on the point that has been reiterated here again and again. We have fantastic provisions within our regulatory framework. The problem is always, as we will see later, implementation. So again, for gas, we have provisions that ensure the sanctity of contract. We have, gas pricing in there, which we'll look again. We have gas supply provisions, and we also have demand provisions as well. Next slide. I like to talk about domestic gas pricing, particularly because it affects everything about development of gas. Now, we have a gas-based price. It's determined on a sectoral basis, on the basis of the various sectors. However, it is important to understand that the gas-based price is actually talking about the gas price at the quality that it is ready to enter into a pipeline, so the pipeline quality. And the question is this: when you have a heritage or legacy facility that was actually built for oil, a lot of these, the current gas pricing regime is not going to encourage IOCs or maybe NOCs to intentionally set up a business to, process gas, except they have a way for making profit themselves from the oil business. And this is what I need to point out very importantly with the way our gas pricing have been set up. So we have gas pricing ranging from 3.2 MBBTU, million British thermal units, to 1.5 for the gas-based industries. And we need to understand that if we need higher gas prices, if we need to bring forward more volumes, because of course, as I said, a lot of what the companies, the oil-producing companies, send out are, wet gas, and wet gas would not class as will not be able to class under the pricing here because it's not pipeline quality. So for you to have pipeline quality, you need to set up a whole gas processing facility that will process gas to the quality that we need. Now, next slide. And this is where I look at the competitiveness of our domestic gas pricing. I understand that in setting up the gas-based price that the government has set up, the idea was around striking a balance. Again, what is the trade-off between a balance that works for developing new gas fields, maximizing export revenues, attenuating price volatility, increasing the supply from existing gas fields, and stimulating the growth of different businesses. So of course, when you find that trade-off, you find out that you're in the middle between free pricing, cost-based pricing, opportunity cost pricing, and of course, you're now having the hybrid. However, as I said, I would look at in the chart at the lower right side, it does work for some context and not for others. If we look at already existing fields that have a gas processing system, fantastic. The price of gas at the currently would work, and we will be able to make a profitable business because those facilities have already been set up. But if you then look at developing, for example, a medium cost associated facility to process associated gas, in today's context, that would not really fly, or marginally would it fly with the current gas pricing. Again, it would not even fly if you're developing a dry gas field, which is non-associated with the production, and you're intentionally going to develop. And that's something we need to understand. And this is why a lot of the intentional field developments are actually bound for the export market, because it makes a lot of sense. So, we need to understand a few things. Domestic supply obligations, which is basically, in simple English, forcing the companies to provide gas, is critical to the growth of our domestic gas-based industries at the current price set point. The current gas-based prices will only support the development of a few onshore fields near existing associated gas producers, as I said, and the development of non-associated dry gas fields, processing plants, and pipelines to prospective gas-based industries will be commercially unattractive under the current pricing. Next slide, please. So, in the next slide, I take out the time to look at a SWOT analysis of the entire sector, the gas sector itself. As I've said, we have fantastic provisions, in our regulatory framework. However, the weakness that comes up is primarily the lack of proper policy implementation. We also have the administrative bottlenecks, long bidding cycles, and contracting cycles. Because I cannot understand how we could start the Nigerian gas flare commercialization program. I think it was in 2017, and we only just got the winners in 2023. That is something I cannot understand. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to any professional. It would not make sense to the international community. Again, low domestic gas pricing is something that we need to look at honestly, if at all we are going to develop the gas value chain. When we look at opportunities and at SWOT analysis, we find out that we have a huge consumer market. We actually have the opportunity again to fix some of the infrastructural challenges using technology like virtual pipelines, CNG, and we also have the opportunity to leverage gas to meet Nigeria's decarbonization targets and industrialize our economy. Again, as I said, we need, when you're talking about developing an economy, we're talking about consuming energy, not selling it out for economic rent. And then the threats of the entire value chain. Political interest tops the chart on the threats. Where political interest would undermine economic fundamentals, that's a problem. Scarcity of funding, and this is where I think we need to understand that the international community would actually not be very intentional about funding us, and so we need to look inwards in putting some of those subsidy funds towards developing our gas infrastructure. The volatile exchange rate regime is a big problem. And the reason is this: even when we look at importation of LPG, it makes it so high that each and every one of us seated here is actually complaining about the effects in our homes. Then, of course, the current, the limited gas infrastructure, which, by the way, I'm going to show in the next slide, or next couple of slides, and then the present reputation of Nigeria when it comes to the international community that we need to fix. Again, we just need to be very intentional. We can't have a narrative that is pointing in one direction. I mean, I've heard release where the CBN says, oh, we're going to clear the backlog in a week of FX in a week, and then 3 weeks on, we haven't seen anything. We need to be very intentional, because that whole narrative about how the international community sees us is very important to getting their help with businesses. Again, one of the biggest problems that has undermined the Nigerian gas value chain has also been the debt in the power sector, which is the number one user of gas, domestic gas in Nigeria, due to weak and unenforceable purchase agreement, gas purchase agreement. Next slide. So in the next slide, it's going to give you a comparative analogy, and there you see that in the Niger Delta, at the time this was taken, we had 190 trillion cubic feet of gas reserve, but we only had 7,500 kilometers of gas pipeline. The North Sea, on the other hand, had less than that, 117 trillion cubic feet of gas reserve, but they had 43,000 kilometers of gas pipelines. And that's to show you that we're having a lot of gas. So let me tell you the implication of this. We're having a lot of gas, which I will call stranded gas. They're stranded in those offshore fields. They're not getting to the users. And then we also have flaring for which, I mean, the oil producers are saying, well, we were set up for, at the time, for oil producing. We have this gas, how do we get it? And there are, next slide, and there are some efforts, although not enough. Again, we're coming to the party very, very late. There are efforts ongoing for the construction of pipelines, but I think that needs to be complemented with the use of technology. Next slide, please. So what are my recommendations in attempting, I'd like to say, to improve gas availability and supply in Nigeria? We need to develop gas transmission systems and compressor stations to efficiently distribute gas from where we're producing to the areas of need in the country. We need to have available functional gas aggregators with functional facilities where oil and gas companies can send their gas to. We need to have pipeline infrastructure, and particularly to tie in the shallow to medium depth offshore gas resources, which otherwise are left stranded, as I emphasized earlier. Again, at this point, I would like to recommend that we begin to look at modular options like the virtual pipeline for the CNG. I mean, we'll see it later on what the picture looks like. It's just looking at CNG trucks. We also have the virtual pipeline for LNG as well. But CNG is something I would say because of the range of distance that we intend to cover in country. So that's something we need to really look at. But most importantly, I'd like to say that the money we save from subsidy removal, we should look at development of central gas gathering and processing facilities in Delta Rivers and Akwa Ibom for the treating of wet gas, which most of the oil producers send out, extracting LPG, NGL, and exporting lean gas into the transmission systems. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is the virtual pipeline technology that I was talking about. And it's basically looking at, again, this is a short-term fix, if we'd like to call it that way, where we have gas and then we have people in the value chain who take this wet gas, do some drying, compressing, get it stored and then distributed across. And CNG, kind of tickles my fancy on this technology option because it's very applicable. It's something that we've mastered how to use. And for the short range of transportation of gas, that works for us. And this is where I think we delaying the Nigerian gas commercialization program was actually bad, because a lot of these technologies would have featured where people come into that midstream and begin to play that role. So I mean, it's interesting to see that we're moving that forward. I think we need to accelerate efforts. Next slide, please. Right, this slide is basically showing what countries have done to deepen the consumption of gas itself, and in this case, the LPG. And whilst this is indicative of what they've done, studying the particular context, I'm not in any way advocating that we adopt either of them. But what I'm advocating for is that we look inward and ask ourselves, what are those frictional points across our gas value chain that we do need to fix in order to deepen the consumption? Because it's going to amount to an academic exercise if we all stay here and talk about gas, and at the end of the day, some of us are still resorting to using another source of fuel like kerosene at home and not gas because of the pricing. So I think a lot needs to be done, because charity, they say, would begin from home. Again, I think that's the last slide for me, and that's just identifying the investment opportunities, because again, we may be talking to someone who knows someone who potentially can bring investment and bail the country out. But let me end by saying that any great transition is always subject to uncertainty, obscurity, but also the hope for tomorrow. There is currently a continuous torrent of initiatives formulating into a river of change. As always, a few would lead the way, and we must remember that those who are crazy enough to think that they can change the world are those that eventually do change the world. This is the time, and now is the chance for Nigeria to rise up and make a difference. Thank you very much.